The Titanic is an example of communication gone astray. At the time, the Titanic was the largest ship in the world, measuring 882.5 feet long. If placed upright, the Titanic would have been taller than any of the modern wonders of her day. Ships this big were generally thought to be unsinkable by the public. The White Star Line, Titanic's parent company, didn't make an effort to disprove the public's assumptions. This miscommunication gave the public a false sense of security. The Titanic was built with a double-bottom hull, which was divided into 16 watertight compartments. The ship could stay afloat if any two of the middle compartments or the first 4 compartments flooded. These safety features only reassured passengers that their assumptions about the Titanic being unsinkable were true. In 1912, the Titanic was considered a technological wonder. Like many of the ships at the time, the Titanic was equipped with a wireless telegraph system. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were hired by the Marconi Company to ride aboard the Titanic and relay messages, although this luxury was only affordable for first-class passengers. Along with the wireless telegraph, the Titanic was one of the only ships to have telephones in some of the first-class passengers' rooms, enabling passengers to communicate with others from in their suites. It took 3 years to construct the Titanic at Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Ireland, one of the largest shipyards in the world at the time. After only a day of sea trials, the Titanic took off from the shipyard on April 2, 1912. On April 4th, the Titanic arrived in Southampton, England, her first port of call. It was in Southampton that most of the crew was hired or transferred from other ships. Because of a coal strike, the White Star Line halted some of their liners and transferred the passengers, coal, and crew to the Titanic. Unfortunately, this caused the crew to be ill-prepared for the journey. Most of the crew didn't know their way around the ship or what their duties were. Regardless, the Titanic took off from Southampton, England on April 10, 1912. It made stops in Cherbourg, France and Queenstown, Ireland, and then headed across the Atlantic bound for New York City. Titanic sailed on smooth waters for the duration of April 12th and 13th. It was on April 14th that the Titanic received 8 ice warnings from nearby ships. Some of these warnings were never passed on to the bridge, and ones that were not taken seriously. Despite these multiple warnings, it wasn't until 8:40 p.m. that Second Officer Lightoller warned the crow's nest to watch for ice. Unfortunately, the binoculars for the lookout in the crow's nest had been misplaced. With no moon out and a calm sea, it is estimated that the crow's nest wouldn't have been able to see further than 308 meters. At 11 p.m., the ocean liner Californian stopped for the night trapped in the middle of an ice field. Before turning in, the Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, tried to warn the Titanic of ice. At the time, Titanic wireless operator Jack Phillips was behind in his work, and he cut off the Californian by saying, shut up, I'm busy!" It was only 40 minutes later when the Titanic collided with a 56-story iceberg on the starboard side. The iceberg scraped along the first 300 feet of the hull, way below the waterline. This collision caused the rivets holding the hull together to pop open, allowing water to rush in. Boiler room number 6 was the closest to the bow of the ship. The stokers in this room were the first to see the damage caused by the iceberg. Just after the men had received the order to stop working, icy water poured through a gash in the hull. Captain Smith didn't realize the severity of the problem right away. This was because after a 15-minute inspection, 4th Officer Boxhall saw no damage as low as F-deck. This miscommunication caused Captain Smith to leave the bridge to take a look for himself. He ordered others to look for the ship's carpenter, Thomas Andrews. Together, Smith and Andrews went to survey the damage, only to find the mailroom on G-deck filling with water. The Titanic could stay afloat if the first 4 compartments flooded, But it was already too late. 10 minutes after the collision, 6 of the front compartments were already flooded and flowing over the top of the bulkheads into the next compartment, causing the bow to sink lower. Soon, Captain E.J. Smith realized that the ship was truly sinking, and at 12:05 a.m. on April 15th, he ordered the lifeboats to be uncovered. Stewards were soon told to persuade passengers to come on deck and prepare to load lifeboats. In first class, stewards knocked on doors and tried to convince the passengers to come on deck. In second class, the stewards would pound on doors, hoping passengers would listen. In third class, doors were thrown open and people would be screaming, trying to make them understand the severity of the situation. Third class was very chaotic. Many people didn't speak English, and in some places, water was already pouring into the rooms and hallways. Phillips and Bride made the first wireless call for help at 12:15 a.m., and at 12:45, the first distress rocket was fired, and the first lifeboat was lowered with only 19 people in it, when it could carry 65 full-grown men. Passengers didn't believe that the Titanic was really sinking, thus making them reluctant to leave the ship. Many of the early lifeboats left half empty like the first one. By 1:40 a.m., the last distress signal was fired. Between 2:05 a.m. and 2:18 a.m., the last lifeboat, Collapsible D, was lowered, and Bride and Phillips sent the last wireless signals. The lights on the Titanic soon failed. At 2:20, the Titanic was finally engulfed by the dark, black, icy Atlantic waters. The survivors in the lifeboats eagerly awaited help as men, women, and children tried to cling to life in the icy water. Before long, the ocean liner Carpathia fired rockets that were sighted by the Titanic survivors. The first lifeboat, number 2, was picked up by the Carpathia at 4:10 a.m., and the final lifeboat, number 12, was picked up at 8:10 a.m. At 8:50, the Carpathia left for New York with the survivors. The Carpathia passengers were the first to realize the true extent of the accident. Approximately 1,500 people were lost in the tragedy. Captain Rostron of the Carpathia did not want to alarm the families of those who sailed on the Titanic. This lack of communication caused distortion and confusion amongst the public. Only Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, was provided with information. Eventually, though, the public did find out and awaited the arrival of the Carpathia in New York. On April 18th, the Carpathia reached New York docks with the Titanic survivors. Nearly 40,000 people surrounded the harbor hoping to see their loved ones disembark the Carpathia, but not everyone was fortunate enough to have this wish granted to them. The Titanic disaster stole away the confidence of the age and made people realize that changes needed to be made. Because of the disaster, ships were required to have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Shipping lanes were shifted 60 miles southward to better avoid icebergs and fog, and in 1914, the International Ice Patrol was created and endorsed by 13 countries to patrol the North Atlantic for hazardous bergs. A bill was soon introduced by William Alden Smith, a U.S. Senator who chaired the American Committee investigating the Titanic disaster. Senator Smith's bill called for 24-hour wireless operation with a range of 100 miles and a secondary power supply in case of a ship's engine failure. Although even these changes could not bring back the lives lost in the Titanic tragedy, the series of failures in communication caused one ship of dreams to become a tragedy that the world will never forget.